My guest today is Latimer Alder.
Thanks, Tom. Thought I'd take a slightly different tack today. This is we're a fairly regular visitor to your place. Today, I thought I'd talk about decoding the language of alarm, which sounds a slightly different tack than I normally take. And the subtitle of this is Climate Fear for Dummies. Those of you who don't know me, I'm Latimer Alder. I'm a independent commentator. I'm based in the UK, not far from London in the Thames Valley. And if you want to get hold of me, my normal home is on Twitter, where I'm at Latimer Alder. A little bit more introduction. As I say, this is the fourth podcast I've done for Tom. The first three, which I've done over the last 6 months or so, were all called such and such for dummies. And I call them such and such for dummies, not because I think the audience are dummies, but because I think it's a tribute to those great books, yellow books you see in the bookshops, like Windows 10 for Dummies and so forth, which tried to take complicated technical issues and explain them for ordinary people like you and me and Tom and the guy you meet on the bus and the person who serves you in the supermarket and the dental nurse and anybody who's not a specialist. And that format seems to work quite well, which is why I've added in Climate Fear for Dummies to the title of this one. The first three were really giving out data and telling you stuff. First one was called Climate Data for Dummies, and that's pretty obvious what it talked about. We looked at the data for climate. And also in there, if you want to learn more about me, first 10 minutes covers quite a lot of ground of my background and how I got to be what I'm doing today. We then looked in the second one at energy data for dummies, where we looked at how the world makes its energy, what sources there are, where it goes, does it go to electricity, and so forth and so on. And the third one, we looked at net zero for dummies, which is where those two things, climate and energy, all come together in the political concept of net zero. They're still up online. You're very welcome to see them. They're up on YouTube and on many of the other platforms that Tom does. Overall, if you put those three all together, you come up with the answer to the question, what's going on? And the answer is not very much. When you look at climate data, you'll see that over the last 50, 60 years, there's been a little bit of change in the climate, but it's only small. It's had no real big effects anywhere. When you look at how people are making their energy, there's some small changes. There's a slight increase in the amount of renewable energies used, but there's a big increase in the total amount of energy used overall. So everything else in that market is pretty stable. And when you come to net zero for dummies, you end up thinking, why are we doing this? It seems to be a solution without really a problem to solve. So if you look at all those three things and you'd come up with the answer, there's not very much to worry about. But of course, in real life, that's not true. People are still worried about climate. Just saw some figures today that says perhaps they're less worried than they were 5 years ago, but that doesn't mean to say they're not worried. They're just, the amount of worry is going slowly away. But they are still obsessed with climate. And today's presentation is really going to be trying to find a way to answer that question as to the why people are obsessed. And I've got a little theory. My theory here is about the basic ideas that people have about how the brain works. And though this may not be pathologically correct in the sense that you couldn't chop somebody's brain in half down the left and right and see they were all doing different things, it is a way of looking at how the brain works, that we have sort of two sides to our ways of thinking. And on the left-hand side, this idea of the left brain, which you probably heard, they were looked at in psychology, is the analytical side, the logical side, the stuff that worries about data. That's the stuff we looked at in those first three presentations I mentioned. And it's realistic and objective and systematic and sequential. And if we were all just pure thinking machines, we wouldn't be worried about climate. But on the right-hand side, you've got the other stuff, which is the stuff that goes with imagination and stories and all the sort of artistic side of the house. Interestingly, way back when, a famous writer in English, a guy called C.P. Snow, wrote some stuff about the two cultures between arts and science. He wrote that probably about the time I was born, 60, 70 years ago. And that's still true. We still have these two ways of looking at things. And my thesis is that the reason people are still worried about climate, despite what all the data tells us and what all those lovely presentations presented by those great people like Latimer Alder tell you, is that it's a right brain problem for many people, not a left brain problem. And so explaining in left brain terms to a right brain person doesn't work. And I'm thinking of an old friend of mine who couldn't grasp science. Very clever man, went to Cambridge University, became a very fine teacher of the English language and so forth, but couldn't grasp science because he was a right brain person. And I couldn't explain to him because I was a left brain person. And that still happens. So over here on the left-hand side, I'm saying it's data versus stories. And stories are very powerful things. We're exposed to stories at a very early age. When mum and dad put you to bed when you were a child, if you're lucky enough to have loving parents who did that, they didn't come in and read you a page of a maths textbook. They came and told you a bedtime story. And if you think of how knowledge was imparted down the ages before there was much writing and so forth, it was the bards and the poets and the people telling stories who were the ones who held the cultural history of the tribe or whatever it might be. And you can see that when you look at the stories in the Bible and the Old Testament and other of the religions. The stories and data are another way of looking at it. And another way of looking at it is looking at numbers versus looking at words. So I'm going to say, let's try and probe and see if this is vaguely true, that it's a left brain and a right brain problem, and we're not talking to each other. And here I was reading a book about medicine for some reason. I'm not particularly interested in medicine, but I came across this guy called William Osler, who was considered to be one of the great founding physicians, not just a doctor, a quack who came along and let some blood or put a leech on you or something. He was actually trying to do medicine as a way of understanding patients. And he said this thing, and it struck me very profoundly. If you listen to patients carefully enough, they will tell you the diagnosis. That's a very interesting thought. And what we certainly haven't been doing is properly listening to what our friends on the climate alarm side of the house have been telling us. Because if you listen carefully to what they say, they tell you an enormous amount more than they think they're telling you. And if you listen to the ways things are said, to what's not said, to the choice of words they use, you can learn an enormous amount about what's really troubling them. And you're getting close to Sir William Osler and they're telling you the diagnosis. When I was in IT, I worked for a while in the sales side of the house. We were selling very big, very expensive IT equipment to big corporations. And the most successful salesman I ever worked with, and the best salesman I ever worked with, was a guy who very rarely said anything. He had taken on board Osler's advice, and he just listened to what the customer told us his problems were and so forth. And maybe he'd put in, I don't know, a couple of dozen words in a 2-hour meeting. But at the end of it, the customer would sign the order and tell him and sign the check. He was very, very good at listening. So let's try and do a little bit of listening to what the climate alarmists are saying and see if that can give us some insights into what's on their minds. But first, we better start by thinking about what are they actually talking about? When I was a teenager growing up, global cooling was on the agenda, certainly in the UK at least. documentaries on the television that the thing that was coming was global cooling. I got to say, if global cooling was really happening, I'd be an alarmist. Global cooling is a dreadful idea. Global cooling says we're going back towards the ice ages, and the ice ages are cold and barren devoid of life, and it's a vicious spiral, vicious circle. The colder it gets, the more cold it'll get for a very, very long time. And we really, really, really don't want to go back there. So that was quite a frightening time. We're also being pretty much frightened by the thought of nuclear annihilation as well, which means that some of us growing up in those times find today's worry about very small things happening really quite hard to understand, because we used to have some very, the end of the world either by being blown up in a nuclear holocaust or frozen to death in an ice age. Pales away a little, it's half a degree warmer in somewhere today, it pale into insignificance. By the 1980s, they decided that actually this global cooling, if it had happened at all, had gone away, and now we were into global warming. Global warming, sort of quite a nice word to use. Warming is generally a benevolent sort of word. So global warming didn't really frighten people very much. Then the first change of language came. We went from global warming to climate change. There's some lovely things happen here when you think about those words. Because climate change can be anything. Anything you want can be climate change, just like, anything you want can be the will of God in medieval times. Climate change, it rained today, that's climate change. It didn't rain today, that's climate change. We've got a big opportunity there to put everything in the world into your basket of climate change. And very difficult to say it isn't. But it's not telling you very much, because you've gone from something that could have been measured, global warming, to something that's much harder to measure, just climate change. In 1992, we get the first very interesting use of language, how it changes. And you've probably heard of, or you may have heard of this thing called the IPCC, the big panel that people think is of scientists who are advising the world on climate change. But if you look at the actual language that's used in the title of the IPCC, the very foundation of this great body, it's not international panel or interscientific panel, it's intergovernmental panel. So we can see even in 1992, 30 years ago, intergovernmental says politics. Says climate change and this stuff is a political thing at heart. It's not purely a scientific phenomenon. It is at heart a political problem. And at the very end of every IPCC report that people talk about, the final people who sign it off and give it the tick in the box are not the scientists, it's the governments. And they tell you this, it's out there. The word is there for us all to see. That probably wasn't scaring people enough. So in the 2010s, so 10, 12 years ago, people started talking about other exciting things. Climate emergency, climate crisis. Oh, this is all getting very good. And by the time we got to today's times, we've got climate chaos, climate collapse, climate catastrophe, climate breakdown. And I've got to give an honourable mention to global heating, which is beloved of our friends in the Guardian newspaper in the UK. That's their brand, is global heating. No, I don't think anybody else takes it up. And global boiling, which the President of the United Nations came up with, just ridiculously stupid. But notice the thing about the 2020s here: climate chaos, climate collapse, climate catastrophe. They're all very nice and alliterative. They roll off the tongue. They start with the same letters. I want to go back to what the poets were saying way back when, 2,000 years ago. Alliteration always is an easy way for people to remember things. So climate chaos, climate chaos. So let's go and look. So what, from just this little history of what we're talking about, what can we learn? And the first thing is, these guys are not scared of the end of the world. They are scared that you don't think the end of the world is coming, and that's why they're upping the ante. And every time they're getting more and more excitable with their words, it's to try and increase the pressure on you to be frightened. It's also more and more abstract. So the more abstract you can make it, the less checkable it is. And fewer people can answer and say to you, no, this is not happening. You know, it is impossible to define and measure a climate catastrophe. So nobody can ever say it isn't happening. And going back to sort of messages that we've had for a long time, I think H.L. Mencken, who was a Canadian philosopher and wit, and still speaks to us today, 100 years later, really talked about hobgoblins. And I've talked about hobgoblins in other podcasts before, but what he says is the whole aim of practical politics is to keep the populace alarmed and hence clamorous to be led to safety by menacing it with an endless series of hobgoblins, all of them imaginary. And here, and you can see in the language, we've got the progression of hobgoblins from something that we could have measured, global warming, to climate catastrophe, which is just a meaningless term, but supposedly will frighten. Fine, so that's the first set of things. Let's do some more listening. We can listen to some of the things people say about what they are doing, why they are doing this. We're protecting the climate. We're saving the planet. We love our children. We're embracing the future. And you see all these lovely abstract nouns: protect, save, love, embrace. Fantastic. Who could possibly not want to do any of this stuff? And if you're slightly cynical like me, and you listen to that and think, well, these again are all hugely abstract things. Nobody can say you're not protecting the climate, because nobody actually come up with what you're actually doing to protect the climate. It's an abstract set of concepts. And if you're in the UK, you'll probably be very familiar with seeing these words not all that long ago during the COVID excitement. We had protect and save and love. The reasons for lockdown: stay home, protect the NHS. For those who don't know, the NHS is our National Health Service. Save lives, protect the NHS. Fantastic. So you listen to the language and they're telling you, we're doing these wonderful, nice things. Love us and support us because these are good things, but abstract. But you over there, you're the bad guys. And here's the word that they love to use for anybody who doesn't necessarily agree, and that's denier. Denier is a very interesting word. People say, and the standard explanation of why they use the word denier is it's an analogy with people who supposedly deny the Holocaust, who say that so many people weren't killed by the Nazis in the Second World War. And it may well be that there's an element of that true. But I think it's one of those stories that goes back a lot further. Because I think denier comes also from the story of the crucifixion in the Bible, where, well, I just checked it yesterday, where the man Jesus is arrested by the Romans and carted off. And his right-hand man, Peter, is asked, do you know this man? And he's asked 3 times, do you know this man, by the Roman soldiers? And in the old King James Bible, the sort of one that many of us might have grown up with, not that I'm a biblical man, but he says, and he denied him thrice. And the denying was effectively a betrayal. Was St. Peter saying, I don't know this guy. He's nothing to do with me. And effectively, he was a traitor to his friend. And I think that's where denier comes from. Nonetheless, they love shouting denier. And that tells you they think you're not on board. You're a traitor to the cause. It's nothing to do with whether you're right or wrong. It's purely not being in the right camp. This idea of having an in-group and an out-group of people, deniers and non-deniers, or right thinkers and not right thinkers. It goes back forever. Any time you go, stories go back forever and ever and ever and ever. And the one I've chosen to illustrate here is the Middle Ages, when we had witch finders. If you were a witch, you got burnt. If you weren't a witch, you didn't get burnt. But there were people paid to go and find witches. And guess what? When you pay people to go and find witches, they find witches. And people can find deniers and so forth when they get paid or have strong incentives to do so. And again, the language is telling us this, that you think about some of the religious cults, you know, there's going to be the rapture and we're going to be saved and you guys over there aren't going to be saved. In groups and out groups. Thinking again, they put in an urgency. 5 years, I've heard so many times we've had 5 years to save the planet and 10 years before the oil runs out, but 5 years to save the planet, 30 years till nuclear fusion arrives, and it's still going on. The Earth is on fire, I saw Greta Thunberg saying at one of her presentations. It's not on fire, but it gives it an idea of being emergency. Repent today and change your evil ways. Well, maybe they didn't actually say that thing, not so many words, but it's what they're leading up to. It's the idea that this is urgent, you have to do something, you have to change your ways, you have to do it now. And I was making a payment to some institution and on the online banking, and there's a little prompt that comes up when you do that. It says, criminals will urge you to pay today. And that's always been true, isn't it? Today's special offer, buy now, runs out at midnight, etc. That's the con of the spiv and the con man and the shyster throughout. So again, the language, the urgency is telling you something about what these guys might be up to. And the last sort of little segment here I'm going to talk about is people looking to the future. And we get an awful lot of that because there's nothing much going on today. Our friends have to rely on what they think is going to happen in the future. And here's some of the phrases they use to try and tell you what that is. Climate scientists say, well, some climate scientists may say, and you might argue, you might ask what some of the climate scientists are. We've got a great thing happened in the UK. There's a big open letter signed by eminent climate scientists. And one of them was a professor of medieval history. And you think, what the heck is he, an eminent climate scientist? And I had it explained to me that by one of the more exciting people on Twitter. Actually, I should have known he was a member of the climate science community, not a climate scientist. What the heck that is, I have no idea. Follow the science. Well, we've had that all the way through COVID. It just means pick your favorite scientist and do what they say rather than what another scientist they say. We've got consensus. Consensus is a lovely word. It means absolutely nothing other than we've got no data, so we ask people what they thought. A very loose and woolly term. And whenever you see the word consensus, which seems to come into climate science far more than any other science, raises a red flag hugely. And predictions and projections are such and such, and scenarios, and all these lovely, vague, abstract concepts that, again, can't really be tested. And when we get to this stuff, something's threatened by something, it means it's not happening. Yeah. Threatened by a flood, it means the flood has not yet not happened. It may be going to happen, but it hasn't happened yet. If it had happened, you'd have put, it is flooded, not threatened by a flood. In danger of, the same thing. And at risk. Oh, anybody can be at risk. Newspapers are full of people saying, and such, children are at risk. Great, you're supposed to be excited, but it never tells you what it is. And the final one I'm going to talk about today, unprecedented. This has never happened before. Okay, so what? But these are all the words they like to use to increase the sense of doom that you get. And this is, again, an old story. You go back to the Bible. Believe that what they had prophets and so forth, thousands of bloody prophets telling you the world was going to end Believe the wise ones or bad things will happen. And again, so that's coming out of the language they use, that you can see this stuff. That's really all I've prepared today for talking about, just those 5 examples that came to my mind in the last week or so. There are, I'm sure, hundreds of others. And what I'd suggest is, if you're interested, I hope you will be, add your remarks and your observations into the bottom of the YouTube that Tom's going to put up for us. And we'll get a debate going. And some of the questions that I think might be very interesting to look at is, first, is it English? This has clearly been an Anglophone presentation. I'm afraid that's my native language. I'm not skilled enough a linguist to do it in any other language. But does it translate into French and German and Spanish and Portuguese and Chinese and whatever your language may be? A lot of the analogies that I've been using come from the sort of Christian story. Do they work in other cultures, or is it a purely Christian thing? And if it's a purely Christian thing, does that explain why climate alarm is basically an Anglo-centric Western European-based problem? Is it that in other cultures, which don't have that same cultural history, they're not so bothered about it because they don't have those same stories? And do the stories that we're telling really go back a long way? Certainly the ones about prophecies go back to the Old Testament. But do all the other ones still go back to, very, very far into human history? We might think, is there an antidote to this stuff? Is there a magic bullet that's going to win it? Or is it going to be like, as Tom, I think, said in an interview a few weeks ago, he says, this is just going to slowly fade away, that people will stop talking about it? Or will it go into a new form? Use the same old stories, but a different vehicle? My guess is that's what's going to happen. The same old stories last forever, the meme, the idea. But we'll go into a different vehicle, a different something to worry about. And you just carry on. This list of possible questions could get as long as you're on anytime you like. Please feel free to dream up all the ones that I haven't thought of, and please feel free to comment and add on to that. We're going to say, please do that, and happy listening. Thanks, Tom. That's all I have prepared for today.
Just in general, how do you think things are going right now online, especially on X? Do you have any comments on what's happening out there right now? Things are going better, or any trends you're seeing, or what's happening out there?
My perspective is somewhat skewed because we have a general election in the UK suddenly called, and that gives a very different slant to most people's views. But under that trend, what you said is probably right. Climate is going down the list of things people are worried about. And that's probably because we've got much bigger things to worry about coming up. And maybe that's what the election has been. In fact, I think I saw some numbers today that said, whereas 40% of people had climate very high up their list of worries 5 years ago, now it's down to 3% in the UK. Now, that's just one number. It may or may not be right. Overall, as I think we talked about some other times, the bills are coming home. Everybody can say they're worried about climate when it's somebody else who's going to pay for it. They don't say you're worried about climate when it's them who's going to have to pay for it. It's becoming apparent to people that, as I think I said, there is no free lunch. You cannot do climate at no cost and live in this beautiful nirvana. Strange enough, we would have done it if it had been a no-cost thing. We would never have gone down the road we did. So it's slowly fading out. We have in the UK, for the first time, we have a politician, a guy you may not have heard of, a guy called Nigel Farage, who's a bit of a, he's on the right of the Conservatives. And he's the first politician that I know of who's come out with a manifesto commitment to say we will scrap the net zero ideas. And that's quite a big thing to go. In Europe, there were European elections for the European Parliament, such as it is. And that all had a trend away from climate alarm, slightly. Not, they're not going to suddenly get up and say we're not worried about climate anymore tomorrow, but it's a general trend that seems to be happening all around here. So maybe in 10 years, climate will be right down the bottom of the agenda. It's still around, and we still need to fight it. We still need to listen to them, as I've been talking about, and see what it is they're up to. But probably in 20 years' time, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Okay, I just got back from Europe, and over there, some people were talking about the EU elections, and there was this deal where they allowed 16-year-olds to vote because the Greens thought that they were going to vote green, but they did not. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah, as I understand it, that was in Germany particularly. And in Germany, they have something called the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, which is a fairly right-wing party. And most of the youngsters voted for the Alternative for Deutschland, which was exactly not what was planned. What is very interesting, though, and this is a little off the top task of climate, if you look at the votes in Germany, you can still see West and East Germany. If you plot them on a map, which constituencies went for the AfD, the right-wing party, and which went for the more centrist, you can still see the border. It was exactly West Germany went for the centrist party and East Germany went for the right-wing party. And there are a couple of little blobs of green, which are in the cities. So Berlin, I think, went green because they're the ones that live in a city. And that's green. Greenism is a city phenomenon. It's not a countryside phenomenon, which again is an interesting possibility. Greenism is the cities trying to tell the countryside what to do. And the what do they call them? The Gilets jaunes in France, for example, is the countryside telling the cities to piss off. I think it would be very foolish to be a big politician when somebody has got when the opposition that you're annoying are farmers who've got enormous great tankers full of slurry that they can project over your parliament buildings at the drop of a hat. Yeah. They're the wrong people to annoy.
So are there still farmer protests going on? And if so, are the general public who aren't farmers, most of them are kind of behind the no farmers, no food thing or not?
I think they're not going on at this very moment. They certainly had an influence, certainly in the Netherlands, for example, not long ago. And there's elections in France coming up. In fact, I think they're halfway through election. President Macron got his comeuppance, rather, in the European Parliament elections, called a snap election. And at the moment, he seems to be, I think, trailing his rival Marine Le Pen quite badly. And if that all goes horribly wrong, the French farmers will be back, have no fear. They spelt blood over the Gilets jaunes protest, and they like the idea of driving into Paris and covering all with big shit, if you'll forgive me. Yeah.
I just read an article someplace that said that the EU chief, Ursula, was kind of backing away from alarm because it's politically unpopular. Have you heard anything about that?
Nothing that goes on in the European Commission surprises me anymore. It is it's the home for failed third-rate politicians who couldn't make it in their home countries. And Ursula is exactly one of those, as was her predecessor, Jean-Claude Juncker, who'd been chucked out of being the Belgian Prime Minister for fraud, if I remember correctly. So he found a nice home in the European Commission. They are eventually sensitive in some ways to public opinion. They have to be just. But the way the European Union is designed is to make it as insulated as they can be. One of the reasons I was such a keen Brexiteer in the time was that you could have made a democratic European Union, and if you had, I'd probably have supported it. But they deliberately chose not to. And that's what really annoyed me and still annoys me about all of the European thing is it is designed to be technocratic, and it is designed to, as far as possible, ignore what the people actually want. I use that word that I can never quite understand why people get excited about. It's populism. Populism means you're giving the peasantry what they want, you know. Well, a terrible thing. You shouldn't be doing that if you're a career politician. The last thing you want is to think of what the people want. Weird.
At this IKEA meeting that I was at a few days ago, there was a slide about the EU spending 25% of their budget on climate. Do you think that's an actual thing that they're still doing? Because I've heard of very few things more crazy than that.
Wouldn't surprise me. I haven't seen those figures, but it wouldn't surprise me. For a while, it was the main driver for everything. Hey, why not? You can change the world, you can save the world, you can protect people. And hey, it's not our money we're spending, it's somebody else's. Don't forget, the European budget comes from the member countries. The EU itself, I think I'm right in saying, has no tax raising powers at all. It can only get what it gets from the member countries. And with the second biggest budgetary contribution came from Britain. And when we left, that kind of must have made a bit of a hole in their arrangements.
Thanks again, Latimer Alder, for your appearance number 4. Appreciate it. Talk to you next time.
Thanks, Tom. See ya.
Yeah,
Bye.
come on.